What is it that we experience when we're alive in terms of the impact that certain kinds of trauma have on us? Trauma has become a very popular buzzword in publishing circles. This has been true for most of the 21st century. And it is a very subjective, it's a very individual kind of experience. It's a very real experience for the people who go through it. What I'd like to focus on is a kind of psychoanalytic understanding of trauma as the result of being a sensitive individual who grows up in a dysfunctional family. This is an experience that many artists, especially many literary artists, go through. It seems to be almost like an impetus for their making art. At the same time, it's very hard to sort of categorize. There are a lot of different subcategories. Tolstoy is famous for saying that every happy family is more or less the same, but every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. And there's a lot of truth to that. I think it takes a long time for writers, literary writers, to really make sense of the impact that their parents had on them. Doris Lessing has said that you have to be grown up, not just in terms of years, but really grown up to fully understand your parents. That's true too. And then on a certain level, there tend to be more insights that happen after one's parents die. Uh, Not because there are new, quote unquote secrets that are unearthed or anything like that, but because one is able to step back from one's parents' lives, is able to look at one's mom and dad and sort of see them as sort of an existential sum total, see them as a human being, a personality who had a period of existence, of life, and made certain choices and was shaped and was rewarded by some of those choices and was doomed by other choices. I know that in the case of my parents, who were both Scandinavian, there was a separateness that I felt as a kid growing up because to come from a Scandinavian background is different from coming, for example, from a WASP background in English-speaking Canada. It's different from coming from a Catholic background. It's different from coming from an East European background. At the same time, the distinguishing characteristic that my parents had, because Scandinavians tend to assimilate very, very totally. My dad, for example, came over to Canada just after World War II when he was 16 years old. He barely spoke a word of English at that time because the Germans had taught Norwegian kids German as a second language, not English. But he assimilated very, very well, so much so that you couldn't tell that he learned English rather late in life. My mom's parents were immigrants, Danish immigrants, and again, there didn't seem to be anything sort of specifically Danish about her, apart from these different anecdotes, many different anecdotes that she told about her parents. Um, so the assimilation part, the linguistic assimilation part for my parents was very easy, but in other ways, certain other cultural markers were not so easy for my parents, and I always felt kind of different. I come from a generation where even my name seems sort of weird and odd in the city where I grew up, which is Ottawa, Ontario. I mean, kids were either francophone or anglophone, and the anglophone kids were primarily WASP. There were a lot of kids who were had kind of quote unquote Mediterranean backgrounds, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, and so forth. They're the francophone kids. They had their own background. To have a name that was like my name sort of made me feel self-conscious, made me stand out. And that wasn't an issue for most of my childhood. It became an issue during high school when I was bullied quite badly. But there were other issues too that kind of made me feel a bit of an outsider, distinct from what I saw as a sort of typical Canadians. Now, when I was a child, I was born in 1960. Uh, Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, the ideas of psychology, the ideas of psychoanalysis were very, very influential on the way people understood their marriage relationships, on the way people understood relationships with their own parents, their own backgrounds, and so forth. But at the same time, there were other ideas that were big in the society of that time. My dad, for example, was he felt the impact of World War II very strongly. His family was split up. His dad came to Canada before the war, and then there was no possibility of communication between his dad and his mom and his sister, who remained in Norway throughout World War II. You know, compared to what other people went through during the war, that is not that severe. Nevertheless, it did leave its mark on my dad. And because of his personality, uh, because of his physical type, he was physically very strong. Because of his confidence level, he was a very handsome man. And because of his temperament, he was very, very idealistic. He tended to focus very much on causes. He spent his whole life thinking about causes. And that's a bit of a double edged sword. When you have an idealistic, politically engaged parent, which again, a lot of literary writers do, you notice certain patterns in your parents' behavior. You know, there's an old saying that the preacher's children have no shoes. And in our case, my dad was a good provider, but there was a sense of something sort of emotionally, not so much missing, but it seemed that my father was very distracted a lot of the time. He was going to meetings constantly. He was focusing on helping people outside the family. He was focused very much on sort of improving society, quote unquote. But at the same time, he seemed a little bit sort of, it was almost like he was wearing a pair of glasses in which he could see far off into the distance, but couldn't see what was so close to him. And I remember commenting to a friend once, you know, because my dad was an architect, it was kind of telling that my dad had never built a house for his family. He was interested in building, you know, cooperative houses, social housing for other people. So there was that element of distance. And in my mom's case, she was from a very artistic background. Her parents were quite celebrated potters, Cal and Erica Dykeman. They're still quite famous uh, in in the art circles of Canadian art history. But my mom unfortunately had a terrible relationship with her mother, my grandmother Erica. And my mom said that Erica was, in her opinion, a psychopath and very difficult to deal with. That, of course, is my mom's opinion, but that sort of troubled relationship that my mom had led her to psychotherapy. And as my parents' marriage started to break apart around the time I was 11 or 12, this was in the early 1970s, my mom became obsessed with therapy. Now, my mom had different issues, whereas my dad was very confident about sort of his physical presence because he is sort of handsome and aware of being handsome. My mom felt that she was sort of homely and overlooked. She had a big nose for a woman of her age, of her time. Uh, she was very attractive in a lot of ways, but she didn't perceive herself as attractive. Underlying that sense of being kind of an outsider was also a very sort of simple but profound and ineradicable form of neurosis, which was my mom simply couldn't clean a house. It was just sort of beyond her. And she had a touch of paranoia, so that she didn't want cleaning ladies to come and clean the house either. It was sort of a no win situation for her. I was the older son. My brother was 2.5 years younger. We grew up in this sort of bohemian atmosphere. My parents fought a great deal when we were kids. Once, my brother, he was only around 5 or 6 at the time, and he had a very sort of uh, big head of very blonde, loose, curly hair. He ended up sort of butting against my parents as they were having one of their after dinner blowouts. And suddenly my parents stopped and laughed because they realized that my brother was trying to stop the argument. Unfortunately, that sort of tender moment, the sort of moment of realization, the moment of insight that my parents had, only lasted a short while because then the arguing started again. My mom's version was always that it was my dad's fault. My dad was strict and sort of a bit pompous and a bit of a show off. My mom said, for example, he used to stand on the porch outside the kitchen and argue and sort of make, uh, accusations against my mother, and it was true. My dad did that a few times, and it was a little bit weird when you think back on it. On the other hand, my mom tended not to take responsibility for her role in the arguing, and she tended to always want to portray herself as the innocent. In truth, as I found out later, much later, when she started to basically lose her mind, she had dementia and some kind of other mental disorder. And she started to enable my brother's drinking. My brother finally succumbed to a combination of liver damage and malnutrition when he was 49. And I saw at that time, as my mom was basically defending the indefensible, lending my brother money, knowing full well that he was going to buy booze with it, taking my brother out of medical settings where he was supposed to get treatment. He was supposed to get detox and rehab for his drinking. My mom would take him out of those settings, convinced that he would be happier in his apartment. Again, being told very directly by my dad and me that this was bad for my brother. At those points, I saw that my mom really had some serious mental health issues. And uh, it made me realize, too, that much younger, when my parents were fighting, that kind of lack of a certain form of basic common sense was probably a factor in the way my parents fought when my brother and I were still very young. One other thing that I think really has a huge impact on a growing individual, apart from his or her relations with parents, is the relationship the individual has with his or her body. And in my case, I felt at the time when I was in late childhood, like 8 or 9, and entering adolescence, that my body wasn't that great. I wasn't really that good at sports. I tended to be the last kid who get picked on to be on a baseball team or something when I was playing, informal baseball games with my friends. I wasn't terrible at sports, but I wasn't gifted at them, and I didn't have that sort of jock vibe. When I look back on it now, I was actually doing pretty well. I exercised a lot. I went skiing a lot. I went skating a lot. I rode my bike a lot. But at the time, I really, really had a severe lack of confidence. And again, this is very common among teenagers. You see it online. It's painful to witness how many young people just tear themselves apart because they feel that they're quote unquote not good enough. They feel very jealous of you know, the quote unquote Chads out there, the Stacys, and they basically think to themselves, everything would be better if I had a better looking body. Well, you have the body that you have. There is some control an individual has through exercise, through diet, and that kind of thing. But in the end, you got the face that you have the basic morphology, you have the complexion that you have. You have the facial features, the smile, the shape of the ears, the sound of your voice. All those things are given, and you can't do anything with them really except accept them and somehow make them work to your advantage. The reason why all this matters, of course, is because of the way we experience ourselves in adolescence as sexual beings. We start to enter that world of sort of sexual love, desire, and so forth. And for a kid who thinks that he or she is homely and below average, that's a painful time because you end up often developing crushes on unavailable others and thinking the best solution would be to be born with a different body. And when you do have those feelings, there is a sort of subconscious anger that one has towards one's parents. In my case, as I said, my dad was extremely handsome. My mom was extremely self-conscious and extremely lacking in confidence. And morphologically, sort of genetically, I tended to think I was sort of more my mom's child than my dad's. Is that really the case genetically? I don't know, but that was the impression that I had. Did it have an impact on me? Yeah, it did. I through adolescence, I've very often developed crushes on very pretty girls at school, and I would get rejected pretty much every time. I slowly started to learn that the really pretty girls were not necessarily the girls that I should even, try to have relationships with. I should also emphasize that adolescence is a very confusing time. I mean, one often makes distinctions now between, sort of cis het and trans people, sort of gay and straight and so forth. In reality, there's this sort of molten kind of quality to sexual psychology. And again, I think psychoanalysis does have interesting insights into that sort of spectrum, into that sort of ambiguity of sexual desire. But at the end of the day, for me, when I was a teenager, my primary experience of sexual love was encountering a very attractive girl at school, developing a crush on her, and sort of pining after her for months or even years on end. All these sort of experiences that the person has as a sort of physical being in the world, and the experiences that a person had growing up in a family where the parents bickered, growing up in a family where the chemistry between the parents didn't seem that good. All of them are very significant, and it's a baggage that we carry for years afterwards. Life often feels that it's like being on a treadmill a running treadmill in a gym where somebody has set the speed just a bit too high, and there is always a sense of urgency, a sense day to day that we have to catch up, that we can't really reflect too much on the past simply because we've got too many obligations right now in the present. We've got too much that we have to do. So that can be a real impediment, that sense of sort of chronic contemporary obligation and speed can really have a negative impact on our ability to find time enough to make sense of our paths. Therapy is a way of creating that time for ourselves, that space for ourselves. Reading literature is supposed to be a way of making sense of where we came from, how our parents shaped us psychologically, genetically, and so forth. But in the end, the problem with both therapeutic approaches and also sort of literary artistic approaches is that, again, because we are individuals, we have to put together pieces. In a sense, a good metaphor might be that we're sort of given a big box of puzzle pieces, like a jigsaw puzzle, and we slowly have to put them together. And there's another box of jigsaw puzzle pieces that we make on our own, and somehow we have to integrate that with the puzzle pieces that we have been given by, quote unquote experts. How is it that we come to terms with our own existence on this planet? Well, that's not a question that's easily solved. We by necessity have to go through this long process of self-examination, self-questioning, and that kind of thing. What does all this mean for literature? Well, in part, what it means is that because the 21st century is so 21st century publishing is so interested in, prioritizes the trauma that results from race, from gender, in particular, to some degree from social class, to some degree from physical type, lookism, as they call it these days. And because 21st century publishing also pays attention to sort of ableism issues, particularly psychological forms of ableism. For example, the experience of autistic versus non-autistic people. All these things are obviously legitimate concerns, legitimate sources for interesting art. But the problem is that there is a kind of exclusion that happens as well. 21st century publishing loves to use the word inclusion, and unfortunately there are particular people who aren't included in that grouping, and that's a pity. Strictly speaking, literary fiction, above all, should be an art form where sort of very sensitive people who feel like outsiders and were kind of ostracized somehow or another can find a sort of a community or a touchstone or like-minded people. And it's not quite that simple with the world of 21st century literary production. I think that we need to get back more to talking about fairly universal experiences of growing up. And we need to also get back to doing it in a kind of linguistically and artistically interesting way. One problem with a lot of literary production these days that is about trauma is that it tends to be very much in sort of this written in the style of a diary, or written in the style of an event that's being transcribed almost the way one would converse to a therapist or a social worker or something like that. And the artwork, the literary artwork, would function better, in my opinion, if it added a sort of touch of sort of linguistic wildness or mystery to the thing being discussed. So that literature about grief, about trauma, about youth, about childhood, reestablished a kind of sense of itself as an art object, as a literary piece of